Okay, I think that'll work. So, Nathan, why don't you go ahead and text me and tell me if the audio is good and the video is good, if it's working well. Actually, go ahead and use the YouTube chat if you can do that, and tell me how the audio is, if everything's working all right. I think that the YouTube chat will show up on here. Audio is low. Very quiet. Well, there's not much I can do to change that. I can try getting a computer if the audio is too low to hear me. If you can't, wear headphones and bump up the microphone. If it's not working well enough for that to be good enough, then we'll postpone this another couple minutes, and I can try using a computer. So let me know if I should do that or not. Okay, so I guess we're doing this then. Alright, so let's begin chanting the opening prayer. Makad hostis iuramon, deletas theoneros, beotan agistue kai, theosue type sukan. Okay, so today's lecture is on conscious living, which is absolutely essential to the spiritual path. You'll notice I tend to say these things a lot about these kinds of lectures when we talk about, honesty, for example, last week or the week before. I said it's absolutely essential to the spiritual path. It's the essence of the spiritual path, right? I said that. I find myself saying the same thing about conscious living. And conscious living and truthfulness and honesty go hand in hand. Because if you're not living consciously, then you're living in a world of illusion. Right? So think about that for a minute. And while we do, let's sit here in silence for a moment before we begin. Let's sit here and connect to all of you just for a minute before we start. So conscious living, very important. It's the essence of the spiritual path, right? So in the spiritual path, like the very purpose of what we're trying to do is realize ourselves, realize the truth of the universe. And conscious living is what that is, right? Because if you're not living consciously, then where are you living? You're living in a lie. You're living in a falsehood, in your own imagination. One moment. Right. So if you're not living consciously, you're living in an imagination, right? Where else could you be living? If you're not living in this moment, if you're not living in reality, then you're living somewhere else. And there is nothing else. So the only place you can be living is in your imagination. And this is where everyone lives. I've talked about this a little bit before. For example, like if you have someone who's not enlightened and they're talking to someone else, I've said before, like let's say two people are talking, or there's three people in the room. Really, there's much more than three people in that room, right? There's like nine people in that room or something, right? Because there's you, and then there's the idea of you, and there's that person and the idea of them, and the other person and their idea of them, and then you all have ideas about each other as well. So like when two people are talking, when you're speaking with someone, you're not really speaking to them. You're speaking to your idea of them, because right, you're not seeing clearly. So there's a line here. It's about 6 inches. It's called the wisdom line. It extends out from here. It connects it goes all the way back to the Gita Hecate, but really it starts like in the pineal gland and extends forward out right through here, out into space, out into your aura, and it begins to dissolve into your aura. And in most people this line is very splintered and fractured. And in its fractured state, it's also congested. And when this line corrects itself and straightens out and becomes purified, and you can see clearly through this line, then you're seeing truthfully. You're perceiving the world how it is. And this is like the Gnostic state. This line has to be open and clear for Gnosis. And so this is also necessary for the higher forms of clairvoyance. We call this the wisdom line. So there's three different lines in the body: the wisdom line, the power line, and the life line. And then there's also a sky line, or a sky eye, right? So there's like a wisdom eye and a sky eye. So there's different lines through the body through which we can perceive reality, right? So there's an epinoia, and the epinoia is our seat of thinking, and it can reside in any one of the three centers. And the epithumia and the thumos are in the nous. So in the Gnostic state, the epinoia is in the nous, and it's perceiving through the wisdom line or the sky eye. It's perceiving through one of these channels. So when you first go into Gnosis, it feels like all of a sudden you were wearing these goggles, and these goggles were like 6 inches thick. And you realize that your entire life you weren't really seeing through these eyes, but you were seeing through this one. But there was this thick lens here, full of all these obscurations and obfuscations, right? It's filled with all of this illusion, all of these ideas that you fabricated. And when you enter into the state, it seems like that shatters, and all of this lens falls off. And all of a sudden you're perceiving the world how it truly is, and the world looks like it's on fire, vibrating with the divine light. And this is the moment, this is what's real, is that this world is being created ever new in each moment, right? They say that cosmogenesis was not a moment in time, but that it exists outside of time, and that the process of cosmogenesis that we talk about in our creation myths, or even in our Platonic theology and cosmology, when we talk about the creation of the universe, we talk about it in stages because it's the only way that we can understand it in our process. But to the demiurge, it happens at once. So you glimpse into this reality where everything is existing at once. As a soul, you're still bound in time, but you're seeing things how they truly are rather than how the senses are telling you. Right? Socrates or Plato, they say that nothing truthful comes from perception through the senses. Right? If we see something, we're not really seeing how it truly is. And any short little bit of philosophical or scientific analysis proves that. We're not seeing things how they truly are, we're seeing how we imagine them to be. So we have our mind and it's orbiting in a circle. And you can imagine that feeding into this circle are 6 lines, or 5 lines, right? We have 5 senses. And each one of these lines gives a little bit of data into this closed circuit. And so one little bit of data is sight, another little bit of data is sound. And there could be something that we're not even perceiving because it exists outside of those 5 senses. So those things we don't even see. And then the things we do see, we're only seeing in the way that our senses are able to capacitate them. For example, we don't see all the spectrums of light, far from it. We see only a very small fraction of it. So these things come into this closed orbit, right? You can imagine it's like a circling, like a whirlpool, and this is the mind. And then these 5 lines keep feeding into it data. And the mind then fabricates an image inside of this closed loop. And this is the world you're living in. It's a world that exists inside of you. Not a world of reality or objectivity, but a world of subjectivity, an illusion that exists inside of you. So in Gnosis, this orbit kind of breaks a little bit, and it decentralizes. And rather than perceiving things through those 6 senses, you perceive it with mind, right? And reason can tell us things how they truly are. For example, we could say there's no such thing as a perfect circle. The closest thing to a perfect sphere in the universe is an electron. That's what science tells us. But that there's no such thing as a perfect sphere. But in theory, in our minds, we can envision a perfect sphere. With our minds, we can come towards realizations using dialectic, using mathematics and Arithma Sophia, right? Using our minds, we can come to realizations that are absolutely true. We can imagine things that are, and even discuss things that are incorporeal, that lack form. But in this world, all the things that our senses tell us are in one way or another a lie, right? So when you go into Gnosis, you realize this. You perceive the world for how it truly is. So before that state, when you're talking to someone, it's important to remember that you're not really talking to them. You're talking to your idea of them. And even when it comes to themselves, right? Remind yourself that they're not really speaking from a point of self-knowledge, right? They're speaking from the vantage point of an idea they have about themselves. An idea that was built by those same senses, that was fabricated by them. And then even further obscured through poor reasoning, poor dialectic, right? Mere sophistry, right? And this is their idea of themselves, and this is where they're engaging with you from. This is their vantage point. So like I said before, if 2 people are sitting in a room and they're talking, it's not really like there's 2 people, right? There's 4 people. There's you, but you're not really present, right? Instead, there's the idea that you have about yourself and the idea that you have about them. And really the conversation's taking place between those 2. And then on the other person's side, there's their idea of themselves and their idea of you. And those conversations are taking place inside of them. And because those conversations are based upon the 5 senses, feeding information into each of you, and because those 5 senses are very similar, feeding very similar bits of information, there's a large overlap, like a Venn diagram. You draw 2 circles right next to each other, and there's a large amount of overlap. But the overlap isn't complete, right? There's a variance there. And this is what causes us a lot of problems in our life, globally and as well as on a personal level. So it's important to remember what's really going on here, so that when you engage with people, you can engage with a kind of compassionate understanding. And also when you engage with yourself, you have to have that same kind of understanding but it should be used a little bit differently, right? Because the only thing you can control in the universe is yourself. So it's no good to be aggressive towards other people or judgmental towards other people. Instead, just be compassionate. But on yourself, you have to be relentless. Because if there's nothing in the world that you can control but yourself, it's true for everyone else as well. So no one's going to control you. No one's going to make you better but yourself. So that burden falls squarely upon you. You have to make sure that you take it seriously and that you make the tough decisions necessary to better yourself. So just remind yourself when thoughts pop into your head, just because the thought popped into your own head doesn't mean it's true. We talked about this 2 weeks ago as well, right? With sophistry, with what Socrates calls pastry making, right? Which is just, it's rhetoric, but rhetoric in and of itself lacks any real virtue, right? Rhetoric is good only when it's being used in a good way. When a doctor uses rhetoric in order to convince his patient to take the medicine, right? But rhetoric can be very bad as well, and that's usually how we use it when we're talking to ourselves. We're telling ourselves, oh, well, it's okay if I do this, and it's okay if I do that. Or I did really well today, and I've been meditating a lot this whole week, so I don't need to meditate today. Or I've had a really long day, and so it's okay if I just relax now for a few hours, instead of doing something more productive, right? It's just sophistry. None of it lacks any real reason. It breaks down almost immediately if you try to apply any reason to it, and that's why you don't. You avoid it in your mind. You put it into some side compartment, this idea. You just kind of put it off to the side, and you don't really look at it, and you don't really question it. Because if you looked at it for even an instant, you'd realize that maybe there was a better line of reasoning, a better course of action to take. So conscious living, when people think about it, they think about being aware of the present moment, but it's much more than that, right? It's understanding all of these things and applying them realistically to your life. So when you talk to people, you understand these things, and when you understand it from their point of view, you understand it from your point of view as well. Right? So when you're talking with someone, let them be ever new in the moment. Don't hold them to who they were in the past. Chances are they're very similar to who they were just a moment ago, but you don't know that. You don't know that for sure because people are always changing. Especially on the spiritual path, we know it more than others. We have to constantly be open to the changes that people undergo on the spiritual path. To our brothers and sisters, we can never hold them accountable for things they did in the past. We don't need to compound the issue, right? Their fate, their karma is already holding them accountable. All right, what Iamblichus calls the improper revolutions of the soul. When the soul acts in a way, right? The soul is meant to, the motion of the soul is meant to imitate eternity, right? A soul is sempiternal, which means it has a beginning but no end. It exists for as long as time exists. So the way that something like that, the way that something within time imitates something outside of time is through a perfect circle. So the soul's motion is meant to be this way. It's meant to be perfect like the planets are. The planetary bodies, the stars, they have more perfect bodies than our own. And they engage in these near perfect circular orbits where their beginning is their end. And our soul is meant to do these things and imitate these things, and that's why our soul is governed by them, right? Our soul isn't governed by them, right? I shouldn't misspeak, but our body is. So when our soul takes incarnation and it takes on this corporeal form, which is really the furthest extension of the soul itself, right? That's why theurgy is so important, is that when you practice theurgy, you're purifying and perfecting the furthest extension of your mind. If you try to stop at the mind itself, you actually don't purify the whole mind. You purify the subtlest aspects of it, while leaving the densest aspects ignored. So that's what theurgy is all about, what ritual is all about, is purifying the whole of the mind. So this furthest extension, this most congealed aspect of ourself is kind of a snapshot, right? We call it like the natal chart. It's governed by a snapshot of the different planetary revolutions. And our life is meant to follow in those paths in order to work out our motion and perfect our motion. And as our motion strays from this perfect orbit, it creates a kind of divisional remainder, right? So like 15 divided by 5 is 3, but 16 divided by 5 is 3 remainder 1, right? So this additional remainder, this portion that's left over, is what we call fate and desire. I was just talking with someone about this the other day. because it's something I like to think about sometimes, and there's some interesting correlations between this and when Timaeus discusses the creation of the world and of the world soul and things like that that I find interesting. But this remainder was what we call our fate, and it becomes oppressive to us. But when we live in a way which is aligned with our fate, then that Iamblichus tells us that that very same fate is understood as providence. That providence and fate are actually the same thing. It's the same force. And when you resist it, it feels like oppressive fate. And when you move along with it, it feels like divine providence. But they're actually the same force. So it's important to always have your palms open and turned upwards towards the heavens, right? If something wants to leave your life, then let it leave your life. If something wants to come into your life, let it come into your life. This is another aspect of conscious living, right? I'm trying to expand your notion of conscious living outside the realm of simply being aware in that particular moment, driving your car when you're driving your car, and talking to someone when you're talking to someone. Those are all very important exercises, but we've heard them many times before. And they're popular even outside of real theurgy and real practice. They're popular in New Age concepts as well. So I'm trying to expand your mind a little bit and talk about conscious living in a more complete sense. And this all falls into that category. Living your life consciously. I'm trying to understand the nature of divine providence. And you see, harmony is how things become one, right? You can have, I've said this before, you can have many different notes, and all of those notes together make one beautiful song. And so this is how many things become one. This is why Apollo is the god of music. So, Apollon means not many, right? Apollon actually literally means one. So, he's the god of beauty because beauty comes from harmony. He's the god of harmony. He's the god of making many things one. So this is what we're trying to do with our lives, right? When we incarnate, we have jobs and families, and we try to meditate, we try to be good people, we try to do all these things, and what we're really doing is we're trying to figure out a way to harmonize all of these apparent opposites and all of these many different things into one thing, one good life. So we're engaging in this, and we have to find better and better ways to do it. We can't skip any steps, right? There are a lot of things we have to learn the hard way. But we have to try to understand them while we're living them. Nikolai said something in the chat earlier when he was quoting Plato, not earlier today, but earlier in the week, or maybe a week or two ago, about how someone who lives consciously, a 20-year-old who lives consciously and with a mind for wisdom is much more mature and will be much wiser than someone who's 60 or 70 years old and lived unconsciously. Right? Because how many years did that unconscious person really live? Not many. Right? So age should be marked, yes, indeed, by years, but not unconscious years, only conscious years. How many conscious years has a person lived? And of those conscious years, how many of them were analyzed with reason and with a philosophical mind? These things are important. It's important to find your sense of religion, right, in anything that you do, right? Because you can be a heathen who goes to church every day, or who even performs his lustrations if they're done without love, right? Like Paul says, you can move mountains and heal the sick, but if you don't have love, it's all just noise. Love is the essence of what we're doing here. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. And the disciples of Plato were called lovers. So you have to try to develop that for your path. Develop a kind of love for your path that overtakes everything that you do. A good way to do this is to try to constantly maintain purity. Constantly be doing your lustrations. You should at least do them every single day, twice a day. At least do them when you wake up in the morning and before you go to sleep at night. But you should try to do them more than that. You'll find that if you try to constantly maintain a kind of purity, performing lustrations at least 4 times a day at the different junctions of the sun's orbit, of the sun's travel across the sky, like sunrise, midday, sunset, midnight, something like that, you'll find that you begin to get a very distinct flavor for what it feels like to be ritually pure. And as you do this, you'll begin to feel a kind of alignment with your higher self, right? And this is your providence, in a way. This is your hand that guides you. In the Gnostic state, it's very palpable. And it's highly dependent, the Gnostic state is highly dependent upon it, right? As soon as you begin to, it's almost like beforehand, there's many things that you can do and only a few things you can't do, right? Like you can't lie, you can't steal, you can't kill someone. There's like a couple of things you can't do, but most things you can. But then after that, when you reach the next level, all of a sudden it flips. It's like there's only one thing that you can do. And there's all these many things that you can't do. It's almost like you can't do anything but this one thing. But that's how it is, right? There's only one thing a planet can do. It has to follow its course perfectly. So similarly, in when you're in some more of the deeper states, you realize that there's like one exact path that you feel this hand is like guiding you. And if you allow yourself to stray from that path even a little bit, it's like this providence begins to slip away and leave you. And all of a sudden you feel like you're left alone again. But as long as you're following that path, you feel like God is behind every thought, behind every breath. He's before your awareness even exists. He's before you. Do you understand? Like, God is closer to you than anything else because he precedes you. So contemplate these things, seek them out as you live your day. Think about God as being the thing that hides behind your very breath. Right? Like with every breath, start with the breath. Think God is behind this breath. He exists within the essence of this breath. Within this breath is a kind of energy, a pneuma, a life, an ensoulment. And behind that, it's vivified and enlivened by the electricity of God. Right? He hides behind that. Then start to realize that he's even behind your thoughts. Your very sense of self, he's hiding behind that as well. And begin to try to become aware of the moment. Live in the moment. Now the lecture says something about being aware for a set period of time every day. And this is a really good exercise. Set aside like 30 minutes of the day. Sit there. And whatever it is, I think a good one to start with is driving. Like when you're driving, let's say you have a commute to work and maybe it's 30 minutes. You can say, okay, well then for these 30 minutes, I'm not going to listen to music. I'm not going to be on my phone. Certainly you shouldn't be on your phone, right? I'm not going to let myself get distracted, daydream, or worry about things. I'm just going to be very focused and make it into a meditation. That I'm only focusing on the road. I'm only focusing on what I'm doing. And if your practices are going well, you'll find that when you do that, you start to enter into that state of stillness that you have at the end of your practice. If your practices are going well, you're practicing every day, especially if you practice that morning. Maybe a few hours have gone by and now you're doing this, but if you're able to maintain this clear focus, you'll find that at first it seems like nothing's happening, but after about 5-10 minutes of really holding on to this, all of a sudden you'll start to feel an energy begin to build up inside of you. This is a good sign of progress. You should always be doing thought control. You should always be meditating. When someone says, how much do you meditate? You should always be meditating. You can do thought control at any time. And any adept that you talk to, it's a given, like they're always meditating. They're always practicing thought observation at the least. That's their foundation, right? Because it's just a clear awareness. That's all that is. Thought observation is just trying to glimpse at your natural state, the state you should be in effortless awareness. Because that's like what you are. That's what the soul is an awareness. So try to reclaim that nature of yours. Try to reclaim your birthright, the nature of what you are, which is a sempiternal soul, a kind of boundless, incorporeal awareness, which is ever new and radiant and full of goodness, right? Try to latch on to that. Once you claim it, you can latch on to ever higher things, to intellect itself, and try to fill yourself with the energy of the gods and move on higher and higher, right? This is the purpose of theurgy. But first you have to have your platform, and that platform is awareness. Another good time to do it is when you're talking with someone, because it's very easy for people when they're talking to someone to anticipate what someone else is saying. So listening is a really good practice in this, especially when you're listening during a conversation that you really want to engage in, something where you're filled with opinions, or you're filled with ideas, it's good when you're talking to someone to just listen and let them talk completely. And as they're talking, don't be imagining or thinking about what you're going to say next. Just genuinely hear them. And then once you're done hearing them, then you can say what you have to say. And try to be very aware, very conscious in the moment. Don't let your mind run around because it's bored or because it's impatient. So these are good ways we can start to hone our energy, because our energy needs to get a kind of stillness about it. Right? You'll find when you're around a good practitioner that they have an aura of stillness. They're just peaceful and patient. That's all you need to be. Trees have it too. Trees are more still than we'll ever be. They've been doing what they're doing for 10, 100, 200, 1,000 years. They've been just sitting there perfectly in harmony with nature. So trees have a stillness. It's why we perform nature practice. It's a part of the pore breathing that you do. You can alter the pore breathing slightly to really try to connect with nature, dissolving your human energy and your awareness, your identity, right? Your egoic nature into nature itself, and replacing it with the energy of nature, the stillness and the vastness of nature, right? It's said that the world's soul doesn't suffer from the same illusions that we do because it's a whole, and the human soul in bringing its attention and awareness onto this body sees only a small part of the greater picture of things, and it causes a kind of distraction and illusion. So nature has a much broader image of things, right? A much broader scope and scale. So by connecting our minds to nature, we're connecting our minds to something much vaster than ourselves. And we're connecting to an energy that's much more perfect, much more balanced, much more whole than we are, than our energy is. So this is a good practice. It's called nature breathing. And it's something else that's good to do, right? To go on a nice walk. If you can find yourself a good park or a good place in nature, go on a walk and just perform pore breathing, but with nature. Try to connect to the trees and the animals and everything around you. And with every exhale, imagine that you're exhaling your energy and yourself, your identity. Think about your name and your likes and dislikes. Really just focus on your name, because you really latch on all of that identity onto that name. And as you exhale, just dissolve that into nature. And then when you inhale, imagine that there's this vacuum, and nature's just pouring in to fill it, right? Because you're not filling with nature. Nature's just filling whatever this vacuum is. You've stopped existing after so many breaths, 20 breaths, 100 breaths, whatever it is. Eventually, you're not really there anymore. There's just this outline, and it's filled with nature. Your awareness is dissolved into nature. It's a very good practice. It will fill you with a lot of energy if you do it well. So if you do it, make sure you sit down and you do some good grounding afterwards. So practice these things. Practice conscious living like this. Practice a clear awareness. Try to keep the mind calm. When you do your meditations and you sit at the end and you let the mind calm down, try to hold on to that calmness as you get up. I always used to do something, when I got done meditating, I would do something where I would try to set aside like a few minutes to really make sure that I transferred that awareness into my daily life. So I'd sit there, I'd do my stillness, and when I was done, I would open my eyes. Only half open at first. And I would sit in this state. This eyes half open, eyes half closed is actually used in some practices because it symbolizes living in the line between two worlds. Right, and I'd sit there in that state and really try to dissolve my mind into the perception of the objects around me, realizing that they're all made of the same substance. Myself and the objects between each other. Understanding that they're all just made out of the same substance, right? It's scientifically true. It shouldn't be hard to contemplate it. They're all just atoms. After you contemplate that for a bit, I would open my eyes even more and continue contemplating this kind of stillness and this emptiness and this peace. And then I would take about 10 minutes to get up and I'd go on a walk. And this was during a really good time in my practice. This really helped me a lot. Every single time I got done meditating, I would go on, once I reached that point, I would go on like a nice 10-15 minute walk. And as I was walking, it would be effortless. I would walk extremely slow, like painfully. No one would be able to bear to walk next to me during these times. I would be walking just so slow it's practically like I was standing still, but not because I was intentionally trying to walk slowly, simply because I had nowhere to go. I was at peace, I felt still, so I would just walk. I was not anxious to see what was around the next corner or to get the view of what that tree looked like from the other angle, right? I was just taking a nice steady stroll down the street that I lived on. Not intentionally trying to walk slowly, not intentionally trying to walk quickly. Simply just walking at whatever the natural pace was, and continuing to make sure that the mind was perfectly calm. And this was a really good thing to do, is just go on a walk after practice. Helps ground you, helps to move some of the energy around, prevent any stagnation, and helps to ground some of that awareness into this reality. I just walk. And I would walk until I felt like I could really keep that calmness with me as I was moving. And then I would begin to start to go about my day. So this is a good practice too. Really focus on conscious living, and as you do, remember what it means to be conscious. Remember that you're not perfectly conscious, and that the people around you aren't perfectly conscious. And that unless you're talking to someone who's enlightened, then really you're just having a dialogue with yourself, and they're having a dialogue with themselves, and the best you can do is just try to be a good person who has a good impact on them. So that when you're orbiting around yourself doing your own thing, and they're orbiting around themselves doing their own thing, and you guys just happen to bang into each other, then hopefully you can benefit them in some way when your paths cross like that. Hopefully you can be a blessing on them. A theurgist should always strive to be a blessing on the people around him. You know, the Pythagoreans, when they woke up in the morning, they would perform their silence, right? They wouldn't speak. When they woke up in the morning, they would perform their lustrations, and they would walk to the nearest temple, and they would perform their ascesis and their offerings, so that the very first thing that ever came out of their mouth was an offering to God. And then at this point, after having finished that, they ensured that the very first time they ever spoke to another person, it was a blessing, because they had built up a lot of energy from their practice, from their offerings, from engaging with divine powers, right? From doing their offerings and chanting and singing hymns, your voice takes on a special kind of quality to it, a power. So the very first thing they ever said to someone was immediately a blessing to them. So this is something we should strive for in our practice. You know, don't say mean things. Always try to be a blessing to the people around you. Always try to be aware and conscious. And remember these principles both in your daily life and in your practice. So we'll close there for the day. I can get questions through the YouTube channel. So if someone has any questions, I'll take a couple questions. Usually there aren't any, but if you have any, go ahead and send them into the YouTube question box thing, and I'll get it. I'll see it. I realize there's some lag, so I'll wait a little bit extra to make sure no one has any questions. Okay, so I think that means no one has any. So we'll close there for the day. Let's all chant together. Makar hostas iuraimon teletas de oneros symbiotan agistue kai diasue type sukan. Alright, everyone, thank you for coming. I hope everyone's having a good holiday, and I hope everyone has a good New Year's and everything. Please try to work on yourself, keep the fire burning, keep the path alive, It's only people on the spiritual path, it's necessary to have people on the spiritual path. Not just for yourself, but for others. Not just for the light we bring into the world or anything like that, but because if someone wants to learn the spiritual path 100 years from now, they're only going to be able to do it if someone kept it alive. If someone kept that flame burning, kept the teachings present. So it's very important. Everyone's always on the spiritual path. Let's try to be ever more conscious of it so that we can do a better job. All right, everyone. God bless. Be victorious.